It was an ordinary afternoon in New York City. People moved like a tide, rushing across streets and sidewalks. The honking of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the hum of life filled the air. Among the sea of faces, a frail elderly woman clutched her shopping bag, her steps slow and unsteady. Then it happened. In the middle of the crosswalk, the woman faltered, her knees giving way. She collapsed onto the hard asphalt, her belongings scattering. Gasps rippled through the crowd as cars screeched to a halt. Some passers-by froze, unsure of what to do, while others stepped back, unwilling to get involved. In the middle of the commotion, an unlikely figure emerged. A tall young man, with a face many recognized, stood on the curb. It was Barron Trump, the son of the former president. Flanked by his security team, he hesitated for a split second. His guards tried to pull him back, advising caution. But something in Barron's eyes changed. Without a word, he stepped forward. The world seemed to hold its breath as he knelt beside the woman. And in that moment, time stood still. Barron gently placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. The elderly woman's eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and fear. "Help me," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the noise of the street. Barron's security team began to form a perimeter around them, their voices firm as they tried to control the situation. "Sir, we need to move you back," one guard insisted, but Barron shook his head, his focus unwavering. "She needs help," he replied firmly. As the crowd gathered closer, whispers began to spread. "Is that Barron Trump? What's he doing? Why isn't he leaving this to someone else?" Barron ignored the murmurs. He pulled off his jacket and gently placed it under the woman's head. A taxi driver, who had stopped inches away from the scene, honked impatiently. Barron shot him a sharp look, silencing the noise. "Call an ambulance," he instructed one of his guards. The elderly woman's frail hand reached out, gripping his sleeve. Tears welled in her eyes. "You're going to be okay," Barron said, his tone filled with quiet reassurance. And for the first time in what felt like hours, the woman's trembling began to ease. As the minutes ticked by, the crowd grew larger. Phones were out, recording every moment. Some were skeptical, calling it a publicity stunt. Others felt the rawness of the scene, the undeniable humanity in Barron's actions. The woman's breathing was shallow, her grip on Barron's sleeve weak but persistent. "My heart," she whispered. Barron's face hardened with determination. "Stay with me," he said firmly, his large hands clasping hers. He turned to his guards. "Where's the ambulance?" "2 minutes out," one of them replied. The crowd buzzed with tension. Barron's eyes scanned the woman's belongings, noticing a small photograph that had fallen out of her purse. It was an old, faded picture of a young woman holding a baby, her smile radiant. Barron picked it up and gently placed it in her hand. "Is this you?" he asked softly. The woman nodded weakly, a tear sliding down her cheek. "My son," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was going to see him." Barron swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. His grip on her hand tightened, not in fear, but in a silent promise. As the sound of sirens drew closer, Barron realized this was more than an act of kindness. It was a moment that could change lives. The wail of sirens grew louder, piercing through the noise of the city. The crowd parted as the ambulance pulled up to the scene, red and blue lights flashing. Paramedics jumped out, moving swiftly toward the elderly woman. "She collapsed," Barron explained, his voice calm but urgent. "She mentioned her heart, and said she was going to see her son." The paramedics nodded, their faces serious as they began assessing the woman. One of them placed an oxygen mask over her face, while another checked her pulse. Barron stepped back to give them space but kept his eyes locked on the woman. As the medics worked, the woman's hand reached out again, trembling in the air. Barron immediately stepped forward, taking her hand in his. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. The crowd watched in silence, the weight of the moment pressing on everyone. Some wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the young man's genuine care. As the medics prepared to lift the woman onto a stretcher, she looked at Barron, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Barron nodded, his face a mixture of relief and concern. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. As the ambulance doors closed, Barron felt an ache in his chest. He stood there, staring as it sped away, its sirens fading into the distance. The crowd began to disperse, but the whispers lingered. "That was so brave of him," someone said. "He didn't have to do that," another added. Barron's guards approached him, their expressions a mix of respect and worry. "Sir, we should get you out of here," one said. Barron nodded but hesitated. "Find out where they're taking her," he instructed. "I want to know if she's okay." His security team exchanged glances but didn't question him. As they made arrangements, Barron couldn't help but replay the woman's words in his mind. "I was going to see my son." Who was she? What had led her to collapse in the middle of the street? And why did her words feel so heavy, as if they carried years of pain? The questions gnawed at him as he climbed into his SUV. He glanced out the window, the bustling city suddenly feeling cold and distant. Barron didn't know it yet, but this moment was about to change everything. Back at his residence, Barron couldn't shake the image of the elderly woman. He paced the room, his mind racing. His guards tried to assure him that the medics would handle everything, but it wasn't enough. "I need to know who she is," Barron said firmly. One of his guards, a man named Carter, nodded. "I'll make some calls. We'll get information from the hospital." Hours passed, and the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. Finally, Carter returned with news. "She's at St. Mary's Hospital. Stable condition," he reported. "Her name is Lillian Harper." Barron's heart lifted slightly at the word stable, but it wasn't enough. "And her son?" he asked. Carter hesitated. "We're still looking into it, but it seems they haven't spoken in years." The words hit Barron like a punch to the gut. He thought of the photo he'd seen, the look in her eyes when she mentioned her son. "I want to see her," Barron said, his voice resolute. And as the SUV pulled out into the night, Barron knew he was stepping into a story much bigger than himself. The SUV pulled into the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital, under the cover of night. Barron wore a simple hoodie, hoping to avoid drawing too much attention. His guards followed closely but kept a discreet distance. Inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. Barron approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Lillian Harper," he said softly. The nurse behind the counter looked up, momentarily startled to recognize him. She quickly recovered and checked her records. "She's in room 214. Visiting hours are over, but I'll make an exception." Barron nodded gratefully and made his way to the room. His heart pounded as he pushed open the door. There she was, lying in the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful. Machines beeped softly around her, monitoring her condition. Lillian's eyes opened slowly, and when she saw Barron, a faint smile crossed her lips. "You came," she whispered. Barron pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. "You're too kind, young man. I don't deserve this." Barron frowned. "Why would you say that?" he asked gently. Her voice broke as she replied, "Because I failed the one person I loved most in this world." Lillian's frail hands trembled as she clutched the edges of her blanket. Barron leaned closer, sensing the weight of her words. "My son," she began. her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Michael. I raised him on my own after his father left. He was my whole world." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "But life wasn't kind to us. I worked long hours to make ends meet, and in the process I wasn't there when he needed me most." He grew distant, angry. Barron listened intently, his heart aching for her. "We had a fight," Lillian continued, her voice cracking. "The worst kind of fight. He walked out and said he never wanted to see me again. That was 15 years ago." Barron's chest tightened. He couldn't imagine carrying that kind of pain for so long. "I've been trying to find him," Lillian said, her tears spilling over. "I heard he was in the city, so I came here. But I don't even know if he'd want to see me." Barron reached out and placed his hand over hers. "You don't know that," he said softly. "Maybe he's been waiting for you, just as you've been waiting for him." Lillian looked at him, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. Barron sat quietly by Lillian's side as she drifted into a restless sleep. Her words lingered in his mind, each one heavy with regret and longing. He glanced at the photograph on the bedside table, the one he had picked up from the street. The young woman in the picture was Lillian, her smile radiant and full of life. Michael's face, though only a baby's in the photo, seemed etched with an unspoken connection to his mother. Barron wondered what kind of man he had become, and whether he had held on to the anger of that fateful fight. As Lillian slept, Barron made a decision. He turned to Carter, who stood by the door. "We need to find her son," he said firmly. Carter nodded. "I've already started making calls. It might take some time, but we'll track him down." Barron's gaze returned to Lillian. He felt a deep responsibility to reunite her with Michael, no matter how long it took or how difficult it might be. For the first time that night, Lillian stirred, her lips moving in her sleep. Barron leaned in, catching her whispered words. "Michael, I'm so sorry." It was a plea, a mother's cry to heal a wound that had festered for years. Barron barely slept that night. The weight of Lillian's story gnawed at him. As the sun rose over the city, Carter entered the room with an update. "We've got a lead," he said. "Michael Harper works as a mechanic at a garage on the city's east side. It's not far from here." Barron's heart leapt. "Does he know about her condition?" Carter shook his head. "Not yet. We thought it'd be better if we reached out carefully. This kind of reunion, it's delicate." Barron nodded, understanding the sensitivity of the situation. "Let's go," he said, determination in his voice. The SUV rolled through the city streets, the normally vibrant atmosphere subdued by the mission ahead. When they arrived, the garage was a modest, worn-down building surrounded by rows of parked cars. Inside, the sound of clanging tools and a roaring engine echoed. Barron stepped out, his presence immediately drawing attention from the workers. Carter approached a man in his mid-30s with grease-stained hands and tired eyes. "Michael Harper?" Carter asked. The man nodded warily. "Yeah. Who's asking?" Before Carter could respond, Barron stepped forward. "I'm here because of your mother," he said softly. Michael froze, his face hardening. "What about her?" Michael wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw tightening. "Why are you talking about my mother? I haven't seen her in years." Barron took a step closer, his calm demeanor unwavering. "She came to the city to find you," he explained. "But she collapsed in the middle of the street. She's in the hospital." Michael's expression flickered with something, concern maybe, but he quickly masked it with anger. "And why does that matter to me?" he snapped. "She made her choices. I made mine." Barron could feel the pain beneath Michael's words, the hurt that had built up over years of separation. "She regrets what happened," Barron said gently. "She's been carrying that pain for 15 years. Michael's hands clenched into fists. She regrets it now. What about back then, when I needed her? Where was she when I was kicked out of school? When I was living on the streets? Barron paused, letting the words sink in. I don't know what you've been through, he admitted. But I've seen how much she loves you. She's lying in that hospital bed and all she wants is a chance to make things right. Michael turned away, his shoulders tense. People don't just show up after 15 years and fix everything, he muttered. Maybe not, Barron replied. But don't you think she deserves the chance to try? Michael's breath hitched, and for a moment, he looked like he might break. But he shook his head, his voice bitter. You don't get it. She left me when I needed her most. You think one visit is going to change that? Barron stepped forward, his voice steady. I think it's not about changing the past. It's about giving the future a chance. Michael scoffed but didn't move. Barron could see the battle raging inside him, pride against longing, anger against love. You don't have to forgive her today, Barron said. But she's running out of time, Michael. And if you don't go now, you might never get another chance. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Michael's face twisted with pain, and he slammed the rag onto the counter. I don't know if I can, he whispered, his voice breaking. Barron placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to know, just take the first step. For a long moment Michael stood frozen, his back to Barron. Then slowly, he turned, tears glistening in his eyes. Where is she? The drive to the hospital was silent, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Michael sat in the back of the SUV staring out the window. His rugged hands, calloused from years of hard work, rested on his lap, clenched into fists. Barron stole a glance at him, noting the tension in his posture. It's okay to feel unsure, he said softly. Michael didn't respond, his jaw tightening. He was clearly wrestling with something deep inside. When they arrived at the hospital, Michael hesitated at the entrance. His feet seemed rooted to the ground, his breathing uneven. What if she doesn't want to see me? He asked, his voice barely audible. Barron placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. She came all this way to find you. I promise she wants to see you. Michael nodded, swallowing hard. Together they walked through the sterile hallways, each step heavier than the last. As they approached room 214, Michael stopped just outside the door. Through the small window, he saw Lillian lying in the hospital bed, her frail figure dwarfed by the machines surrounding her. His eyes filled with tears. She looked so fragile. She's been waiting for you, Barron said gently. Go to her. Michael took a deep breath and stepped inside. The sound of the door opening made Lillian stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she seemed disoriented. But then she saw him, her son, and her breath hitched. Michael, she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael stood frozen, his eyes fixed on her. He looked like he wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he managed to take a step forward. Mom, he said, his voice cracking. Tears streamed down Lillian's face as she reached out a trembling hand. Is it really you? Michael nodded, his own tears falling freely now. He took her hand in his, feeling how fragile she had become. I'm here, he said softly. I thought I'd lost you forever, Lillian sobbed, clutching his hand like a lifeline. I've prayed every day for this moment. I'm so sorry, Michael. I'm sorry for everything. Michael shook his head, his emotions too overwhelming for words. He sank into the chair beside her, holding her hand tightly. For a long time, they didn't speak. They simply held on to each other, years of pain and separation dissolving in their shared tears. Barron stood quietly by the door, his chest tight with emotion. He knew he had just witnessed something extraordinary. a moment of healing that would forever change two lives. Hours passed as Michael and Lillian talked, their voices low and filled with raw emotion. They shared stories, regrets, and apologies, slowly chipping away at the wall that had kept them apart for so many years. "I never stopped loving you," Lillian said, her eyes brimming with sincerity. "I was just too scared to face the mistakes I made." Michael nodded, wiping his eyes. "I never stopped loving you either, Mom. I was just too hurt to reach out." Barron watched from the corner of the room, feeling like an outsider in the most beautiful way. This wasn't his moment, it was theirs. Yet he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of fulfillment. As the night wore on, Lillian's strength seemed to improve. Her voice grew steadier, her laughter softer but genuine. Michael even managed to smile, something that seemed impossible just hours earlier. Before leaving, Barron stepped closer to the bed. "I think you two have a lot to catch up on," he said with a smile. Michael stood and extended his hand to Barron. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't think I would have come if it weren't for you." Barron shook his hand firmly. "You did the hard part, Michael. You found the courage to forgive." As Barron turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. Lillian and Michael were holding hands, their bond stronger than ever. Barron walked out of the hospital room, his mind replaying the emotional reunion. His heart felt heavy but full, as if witnessing Lillian and Michael's healing had stirred something deep within him. He leaned against the wall, taking a moment to compose himself. Carter approached, his usual stoic demeanor softened. "That was something else," he said quietly. Barron nodded. "It's moments like this that remind you what really matters." As they exited the hospital, the night air felt crisp and cool. A small crowd of reporters had gathered outside, drawn by whispers of Barron Trump's unexpected visit. The cameras flashed, and questions flew, but Barron raised a hand, silencing them. "I'm not here to talk about myself," he said firmly. "I want to share a story. One of a mother and son who lost their way, but found each other again. It's a reminder that no matter how broken things seem, there's always hope for forgiveness and love." The reporters listened intently, their pens scribbling furiously. Barron's words carried a weight that transcended his celebrity status. As he finished, a small voice from the crowd called out, "Does it make you believe in miracles?" Barron smiled faintly. "It makes me believe in the power of kindness, and how even the smallest act can spark a miracle." The next morning, news of Barron's act of kindness spread like wildfire. Headlines praised his compassion, and social media buzzed with the story of Lillian and Michael's reunion. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of forgiveness and second chances. Strangers reached out to loved ones they hadn't spoken to in years, inspired by the tale. Hospitals reported an uptick in visitors, as people rushed to mend broken relationships before it was too late. Meanwhile, Barron visited the hospital one last time before returning to his busy schedule. He brought a bouquet of flowers for Lillian and a small toolbox for Michael, a nod to his work as a mechanic. Lillian beamed when she saw him. "You've done more for us than I could ever thank you for," she said, tears shining in her eyes. Barron shook his head. "You and Michael did the hard part. I was just the guy in the right place at the right time." As he left the hospital, Barron felt a profound sense of peace. He knew this wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of a ripple effect that would touch countless lives. Weeks later, Michael sat at Lillian's bedside as she recovered. Their relationship was still fragile, but each conversation, each shared memory, was a step toward rebuilding what they had lost. One sunny afternoon, Lillian smiled at her son and said, "You know, I think I'm going to be okay. And I owe it all to that young man." Michael nodded. He reminded me that it's never too late to make things right. Meanwhile, Barron carried on with his life, but the experience stayed with him. It wasn't just a story for the headlines. It was a lesson he would carry forever. In a rare interview, when asked about the event, Barron said, "If there's one thing I learned, it's that we're all connected. Sometimes it takes just one moment of courage to change someone's life." Have you ever had a moment where kindness changed your life? Share it in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more inspiring tales that remind us of the beauty in humanity. Let's spread this message of love and forgiveness far and wide. Together, we can make a difference. Bubble